The upper gallery was never meant to be lived in. It's a maintenance space concrete spine running the length of the dam, suspended above the spillway gates, sealed from weather and river spray. No windows, no daylight. Just access hatches, cable trays, hydraulic lines, and instrumentation cabinets bolted into the walls like organs. When the dam was decommissioned, they drained most of the control systems and locked the galleries. They did not remove them. That's why I stayed. The river still moves. The structure still responds. And somewhere upstream, old reporting protocols still expect regulated flow, even if no one remembers why. I learned that during the first winter after everything failed. I was a regional instrumentation tech before the outbreak. Level sensors, actuator feedback, backup generation. When the control authority vanished, the dam went into passive hold. Gates froze in last known positions. Flow flattened into something like equilibrium. Not safe, not dangerous, just unresolved. The telemetry link still pinged once every 12 hours. It doesn't carry voice. Just status, upstream level, downstream level, gate positions, power availability. As long as those values stay within tolerance bands, the system reports regulated. When they drift, escalation begins. Automated flags, reroutes, eventually physical inspection. Inspection is what I avoided. The gallery sealed easily. Heavy doors, manual dogs, no external access except the crest road, which collapsed in the second year when unchecked seepage undermined the western approach. Zombies don't climb steel ladders over moving water. People rarely try. I rationed diesel for the backup generator carefully. Solar on the crest still fed trickle charge into the battery room below, but I trusted rotating mass more than panels fouled by birds and ash. I calibrated sensors manually once a week, stilling wells cleared of debris, pressure transducers zeroed against known head. Every few days I exercised the spillway actuators just enough to keep seals from binding. Never enough to change flow meaningfully. That was the rule. A 0.5% gauge jog every 3 weeks, small enough to register as maintenance drift, large enough to confirm the system was still alive. Downstream, the river barely noticed. Upstream, the reservoir stayed placid, its surface dull and brown, carrying things past the intake towers without comment. I slept on a cot wedged between cabinet C and the cable riser, made canned food cold, drank filtered river water that smelled faintly of rust and algae, logged everything in pencil on waterproof paper because ink bled in the humidity. Routine kept the dam quiet, until the readbacks changed on their own. It started with Gate 3. At 021L, according to the gallery clock, which I kept wound even after time stopped mattering, the position indicator ticked from 4220% to 4221%, 0.1%, within tolerance. Easy to miss. I noticed because I had just logged it at 4220% before sleeping. I assumed drift. Hydraulic temperature change. Sensor noise. I recalibrated the transducer the next morning. It held steady. 2 nights later, Gate 5 adjusted the same way. Then Gate 3 again. Always at night. Always 1/10. Never simultaneous. Never during generator run windows or maintenance cycles. Deliberate. I stopped exercising the actuators entirely. The next night, nothing moved. The night after that, Gate 7 incremented. That's when I understood the problem. Someone downstream was watching the river closely enough to notice which changes correlated with live maintenance. Not big adjustments. Those would draw attention upstream. The small ones. The confirmation movements. The proof-of-life signals I trained the system to expect. They had learned which motions meant I was still here. And they were answering them. I shut off the gallery lights and sat in the dark, listening to water press against concrete older than me, older than the river's current course. Above, the reservoir held. Below, the river carried whatever it carried. At 02000, Gate 3 ticked again. 42.2%. The dam hadn't failed. It was being communicated with. I isolated the feedback loops first. Not because I thought it would stop the changes, but because I needed to know where the instruction was entering the system. Each gate has 3 independent readings: actuator position, hydraulic pressure, and mechanical limit count. The telemetry packet only transmits the synthesized value, the one most operators trust because it's already been reconciled. At 0600 I broke that trust. I pulled the reconciler offline and logged raw values locally. The next night, gate 3 moved again. The actuator pressure rose slightly, the limit count advanced 1 notch, but the mechanical linkage did not shift. The gate itself hadn't moved, only the belief that it had. Someone wasn't opening the spillway. They were writing to the interpretation layer, nudging the system just enough to see whether I corrected it. I didn't. I let the readback stand at 42.3% all day. No recalibration, no maintenance jog, no acknowledgement. Downstream level stayed stable. Upstream rose a fraction of an inch, well within seasonal variance. The dam didn't care. The river didn't care. That night, nothing changed. The pattern was clear now. Movement invited response. Silence stalled it. I slept in short cycles, waking every hour to check the panels by headlamp. The gallery felt different with the reconciler offline, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The constant low awareness that the system was summarizing itself somewhere outside my control was gone. At 0317, the radio squelch cracked. I hadn't powered the radio in weeks. It was an old VHF unit wired into the dam's emergency net, kept more out of habit than expectation. The noise wasn't voice, just a carrier pulse, long enough to register and drop. I did not answer. In the morning, I ran a full diagnostic on the upstream level sensors. No anomalies, no tampering, no unexpected draw. The intake towers were clear, trash racks intact. Whatever was interacting with the dam wasn't doing it physically. Not yet. I shut down the backup generator and let the batteries carry load. Reduced power meant fewer active systems, fewer surfaces to write on. The gallery dimmed as non-essential panels went dark. I moved slowly, counting steps between cabinets, mapping the space by touch again. That afternoon I found a discrepancy in the logs. Not missing entries, altered ones. Pencil marks smudged and overwritten, my own handwriting adjusted just enough to change decimals. A 0.1% here. A timestamp shifted by minutes. The changes aligned with the Knights of Gate movement. I hadn't made them. I burned the affected pages in a maintenance sink and watched the ash wash away into the drainage channel that fed back into the river. Records matter only if someone is reading them. I was done being legible. That night, the dam stayed still. No gate increments, no radio pulses. The system, deprived of my corrections, had lost its conversational partner. I thought that meant I'd won. At 0440, the downstream level sensor reported a drop. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to be noticed by someone paying attention. Someone downstream was no longer asking if I was here. They were testing whether I would intervene. I watched the downstream trace for 2 hours. The drop stabilized at -3 centimeters relative to the previous night's mean, within tolerance, within noise. But it held steady in a way natural variance rarely does. Rivers wander. This one had chosen a value and stayed there. I did nothing. By mid-morning, the upstream level compensated slightly, surface creeping higher against the intake towers. The dam was doing what it had always done when unattended, seeking equilibrium through mass, not control. If the downstream reduction continued, spillway logic would eventually recommend a gate adjustment. Recommend, not execute. With the reconciler offline, it couldn't act alone. I left it that way. The gallery stayed quiet through the afternoon, no radio activity, no ghost increments. I ate without appetite and drank more than planned. Humidity pressed in, condensing along the colder concrete seams. I wiped it away mechanically, not because it mattered, but because my hands needed something to do. At 1900 I reconnected one system, not a gate, not a sensor. The emergency siren. It's a relic from before automated alerts, manual, physical, mounted on the crest, powered through a separate line, isolated from telemetry, loud enough to carry miles downstream if activated, loud enough to draw attention I didn't want. I tested continuity only. No sound. That night, the downstream level dropped another centimeter. Still no alarms. Still deliberate. I understood then that whoever was interacting with the dam wasn't trying to cause failure. They were shaping conditions. Lowering the river slowly, quietly, to see when I would decide it mattered. The old me would have corrected at 2 centimeters. The trained me waited for 3. The system me waited for alarms. I waited for myself. At 0230 the radio pulsed again. This time twice. Short. Precise. Like punctuation. I turned it off at the breaker. At dawn, the downstream level stabilized. The upstream rose another fraction. The reservoir surface crept closer to a line I'd memorized years ago, the one where debris patterns change, where pressure on the aging concrete shifts from distributed to focused. That line was still a day away. Maybe 2. I made coffee for the first time in weeks, burned fuel for it. Let the generator run just long enough to heat water and remind the system, any system, that I could still choose an efficiency. No response followed. By afternoon, fatigue set in, not physical, cognitive. Decision fatigue is dangerous around infrastructure. I lay on the cot and stared at the underside of the spillway deck, counting cracks that had always been there. When I woke, the downstream level had risen back to baseline. No gate movement recorded, no actuator pressure change, no upstream release. The river had corrected itself. That shouldn't have been possible. Rivers don't reset without cause. Someone downstream had intervened, opened something, blocked something, changed flow beyond the dam's influence. They had restored balance without asking me to do it, which meant they didn't need me anymore. That realization carried more weight than threat. At 2000, Gate 3's readback ticked down, 42.2%. A reversal. An answer. They weren't asking if I was still maintaining the dam. They were showing me they could replace the function, increment by increment, until my presence was redundant. I shut off the gallery lights and sat in the dark, listening to water move through concrete I no longer fully controlled. For the first time since I sealed myself in, the dam did not feel like shelter. It felt like an audition. I was quietly failing. I stopped thinking of the dam as a machine. That shift wasn't philosophical. It was practical. Machines respond to input. This structure was responding to absence, to restraint, to the edges of decision I refused to cross. Someone downstream understood those edges as well as I did. I brought the reconciler back online, not fully. I left 2 of the 3 inputs live and masked the third with a static offset. The synthesized gate position would still update, still look credible, but it would lag reality by a margin only an insider would notice. A controlled error. A fingerprint. That night, Gate 5 adjusted. 42.0% to 42.1%. The offset held. The reconciler reported 42.1%. The raw mechanical count did not change. The actuator pressure blipped and settled. They were still writing to the interpretation layer. I waited. At 031 Phoebe, the reconciler corrected itself. Not snapped. Not reset. Smoothed like a human easing a value into alignment rather than triggering an alarm. The offset I had injected vanished, replaced by a clean synthesis that matched the falsified actuator signal. They had found my fingerprint and erased it. I powered the reconciler down again, harder this time, pulled fuses, physically separated the bus. The gallery lights flickered as load shifted. Somewhere deep in the dam, water moved with a sound like breath being held. Silence followed. Morning came heavy and damp. The smell of river rot crept into the gallery through seams that had never leaked before. I checked the drains. Clear. The smell wasn't from water intrusion. It was from stagnation upstream. A change in circulation pattern I couldn't see from here. At 1000, I climbed the access ladder to the crest hatch. I hadn't done that in months. The ladder shook under my weight, vibration traveling through steel into concrete. Above, daylight leaked around the hatch seal. I cracked it open just enough to look. The reservoir surface was wrong. Not level still within spec, but textured differently. Long, slow ripples moved against the wind, converging toward the intake towers in a pattern that suggested controlled draw. Someone upstream? Unlikely. There was nothing left upriver but dead towns and failed weirs. Downstream control made more sense. I closed the hatch and sealed it, heart rate elevated, hands shaking longer than I expected. I sat on the ladder until it passed. That afternoon the siren continuity light flickered. Once. I hadn't touched it since the test. The breaker was still open. I disconnected it entirely. At dusk, the downstream level dropped again, this time 5 centimeters. That crossed my line. I could let it continue and risk cavitation damage below the spillway, long-term, irreversible. Or I could intervene and confirm, again, that I was still here, still useful. I chose the third option. I opened Gate 2 by 1%. Not a jog, not a maintenance twitch, a real movement. Slow, controlled, logged nowhere. Enough to restore downstream level without matching any pattern I'd used before. The dam responded immediately. Pressure equalized. The river surged briefly, then settled. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then every gate readback updated at once. Not to new positions, to the exact values they had held before I moved. A rollback. Someone had overwritten the state of the system, not just the interpretation. The dam believed it had never moved. I sat down hard on the concrete floor, breath shallow, palms pressed flat, as if I could anchor myself by friction alone. This wasn't communication anymore. It was version control. And I no longer had right access. I stopped touching the gates. That wasn't surrender. It was containment. Any further actuation risked teaching them something new, and I was already behind in that exchange. If they could roll the system state backward, rewrite history at the controller level, then my interventions weren't corrections. They were test cases. I spent the next day auditing damage without fixing it. Downstream cavitation risk remained low for now. The spillway face showed no new spalling. Vibration sensors still live on an isolated loop, reported nominal resonance. The dam could tolerate a few more centimeters of manipulation before consequences compounded. Whoever was downstream knew that too. They were staying inside the envelope. At 1400, I found the first physical change. A valve tag was missing, not torn, not broken. Removed cleanly from the stem of an auxiliary hydraulic bleed. The valve itself was untouched. Closed, as it should be. But the tag-yellowed plastic stamped with an ID I could recite from memory was gone. I searched the gallery methodically. It wasn't misplaced. It had been taken. That was new. Until now, everything had happened in layers: data, interpretation, system belief. This was contact. Minimal, precise, and meant to be noticed. I sat with the valve for a long time, hand resting on the cold metal, listening to water move beyond meters of concrete. I did not reinstall a tag. I did not mark the absence. I left it undocumented, an intentional blind spot. That night, the downstream level held steady. No drops, no rises, no adjustments upstream. The river ran as if the dam were truly abandoned, free within constraints it no longer questioned. No static preamble. It carried fatigue. Not emotion. Fatigue of process, of repetition. The kind that comes from maintaining something too long without relief. I did not answer. The voice did not repeat. In the morning, I checked the generator fuel. Down by 10%. I hadn't run it. The batteries were still near full. No unexplained draw. No evidence of load. The fuel had been consumed without power generation. Someone had used the generator as a signal, not a source. I shut it down completely and disconnected the starter solenoid. Mechanical denial. Old methods. By midday, condensation streaks appeared along the east wall, thin vertical lines evenly spaced. Not leaks, thermal gradients. The dam was redistributing internal temperature, compensating for something external. Or internal that I wasn't measuring anymore. I felt small for the first time. Not threatened. Reduced. Like a redundant component left powered only because no one had bothered to remove it yet. At dusk, I heard movement in the spillway. Not water. Footsteps. Echoed, distant, distorted by the geometry. Someone was on the concrete face below the gates, where spray and algae make footing dangerous even in daylight. That wasn't exploration. That was confidence. I climbed halfway up the ladder to the crest hatch and stopped. Opening it would expose me. Leaving it closed would confirm I'd heard and chosen not to engage. I stayed where I was. The footsteps continued for several minutes, then stopped directly beneath the gallery. I could feel the vibration through the ladder rails. A knock followed. Concrete on concrete. 2 sharp impacts. Measured. Then nothing. I descended slowly, every muscle tight, and sat on the floor of the gallery with my back against the wall. The dam hummed around me, alive in ways I no longer mediated. For the first time since I sealed myself inside, I considered that the safest thing I could do, for the structure, for the river, for myself, was nothing at all. And I didn't know whether that choice still belonged to me. I stayed still through the rest of the night. Not frozen breathing, shifting weight when cramps set in, but operationally inert, no systems touched, no panels checked, no data acknowledged. I let the dam exist without my interpretation layered over it. Morning arrived without incident. That absence felt intentional. The downstream level held within a tight band, narrower than I'd ever managed when I was actively tuning it. Upstream, the reservoir surface smoothed out, debris lines reorganizing themselves into long arcs that suggested steady draw without turbulence. The structure sounded different. Less corrective noise, fewer micro-adjustments in the hydraulics. The dam was no longer compensating for me. I checked the vibration sensors once, out of necessity. They were still reading, still local. No spikes, no new harmonics. Whatever was happening, it wasn't stressing the concrete. At 09:30, I found the valve tag. Not clipped. Threaded. The nylon tie had been replaced with stainless wire twisted tight, the way older techs used to do it before disposable tags became standard. The ID number was correct. The orientation was correct. The wire ends were bent inward so they wouldn't snag clothing. Someone knew the habits of people who worked these systems before they were automated. I didn't touch it. That afternoon, I noticed the gallery clock. It had moved. Not advanced normally, jumped. From frozen noon to 14,037. The hands were steady. The mechanism sounded healthy. I checked it against my watch. It matched. I felt a sharp, irrational anger at that. Timekeeping had been mine. A small private assertion of sequence in a place that blurred cause and effect. Now it had been corrected without asking. I stopped wearing the watch. At 1600 the radio powered on again. This time, it stayed on. No voice, just open channel. Ambient noise from somewhere downstream. Water, wind, the faint clatter of something metallic striking stone. Real sounds, not synthesized. I realized I was being given situational awareness, not surveillance. Shared context. I sat beside the radio and listened for nearly an hour. The sound shifted subtly closer, farther, changing angle. Someone was moving along the riverbank, not hurried, not hiding, working. At sunset the sounds faded. The radio clicked off. The downstream level rose 1 centimeter. Not a test, a courtesy. Compensation for evaporation I hadn't logged. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no pressure. Just the heavy, featureless rest of someone who was no longer making decisions that matter. I woke before dawn to the sound of the siren. Not full volume, not the emergency wail. A single pulse. Enough to vibrate the gallery walls and die. A marker. I stood and felt the dam around me, massive, indifferent, but no longer opaque. Whatever was interacting with it wasn't trying to take control. Control was inefficient. They were distributing it. I understood the shape of the offer then. I could stay and become an observer. A redundant sensor kept alive because redundancy has value. Or I could leave and let the system continue without the last human bias it still contained. Neither option was safe. Both were stable. I sat at the instrument table and opened the notebook for the first time since decoupling began. I wrote one line. Manual oversight discontinued. Then I tore out the page and left it on the table, unfiled, unburned. If someone was reading, they would understand. If no one was, it didn't matter. I lay back on the cot as the river moved through concrete that no longer needed me to explain it. And for the first time since the dam became my shelter, I felt the strange, hollow relief of a system that had finally learned how to go on without its last operator. I did not leave the gallery. Not immediately. Discontinuation is not the same as absence, and systems, human or otherwise, treat those differently. I needed to know which one the dam understood. For 2 days I did nothing. I ate, slept, drank water, walked the length of the gallery twice a day to keep my legs from locking up. I did not check levels. I did not acknowledge readbacks. I did not correct anything that drifted. The notebook stayed closed where I'd dropped it. The dam continued to regulate. Downstream variance stayed tight. Upstream draw adapted to temperature and inflow without oscillation. Vibration sensors stayed calm, no siren pulses, no radio voices. Whatever collected was operating downstream, or whatever process had replaced them did not need reassurance. On the third night, something changed. Not in the data, in the sound. Water has a baseline voice when it moves through a structure this large. You learn it unconsciously. The pitch of flow under gates, the low thunder in draft tubes, the intermittent slap of debris against concrete. That night, a new tone appeared beneath it all. A slow, rhythmic surge, like breathing with intent. I sat up on the cot and listened. The rhythm did not correspond to any gate cycle. It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't surge tank resonance. It was too slow. Too deliberate. I climbed the ladder to the crest hatch again. This time, I opened it. The reservoir was lower than it had been since decommissioning, not dangerously. Precisely. The water line traced a contour I'd only ever seen in old design diagrams, the pre-optimization baseline, when the dam was still being tested and the river allowed to teach the structure how it wanted to move. They were running the river in learning mode. I closed the hatch and leaned my forehead against the cool metal until the dizziness passed. By morning, I found more changes. Not intrusions, reversions. Old labels reappeared on panels I hadn't touched in years. Handwritten notes in grease pencil. Mine, from early maintenance days, faint but legible, like someone had cleaned just enough grime away to reveal them. Calibration marks on valve wheels aligned exactly with factory references, not my later adjustments. My corrections were being unwound. Not erased, superseded. At 1100 the radio spoke one last time. We're done tuning. Plural. That was important. Not you're done, not it's done. We. I sat with that until the word lost shape. By afternoon, the offer clarified itself without further explanation. The dam no longer required a resident interpreter. It required a witness only if one insisted on being present. My continued occupancy was now just mass, heat, and unpredictability layered onto an otherwise coherent system. A disturbance. I packed slowly. Not efficiently. Deliberately badly. I left useful things behind. Tools, meters, spare filters. I took only what kept me alive without explaining me. Food, water, rope, a knife. The notebook stayed. At the gallery door, I hesitated. For years, I believed survival meant staying embedded in function, making myself necessary so the structure would shelter me in return. The dam had accepted that bargain until something better arrived. Something quieter. I sealed the door behind me and dogged it tight, not to protect what was inside, but to formalize the separation. No easy return. No half occupancy. As I stepped onto the crest road, the siren pulsed once. Acknowledgement. Not farewell. I did not look back at the gates. I walked downstream instead. Along the path the river now preferred, leaving the dam to remember me only as a brief, inefficient phase in its long adjustment toward balance. The crest road degraded faster than memory suggested. Cracks had widened into offsets. Asphalt sagging where fill had washed out beneath it. I moved carefully, keeping to the upstream edge where the camber still held. Below me, the spillway face glistened with a thin, even sheen of water. Controlled, intentional, not the chaotic sheet I'd learned to read for warning signs. I did not hear footsteps behind me. That mattered. By midday, I reached the first switchback down toward the riverbank. The access stairs there had partially collapsed years ago, but the handrail still held. I descended slowly, weight-centered, letting gravity do the work. At the bottom, the air felt different, cooler, heavier with moisture and plant decay. Life had returned here faster than upstream. Reeds along the bank. Insects. Frog calls that cut through the constant water noise. I followed the river. Not the service path. I avoided anything that looked maintained, but the margin where silt met stone, where the river negotiated its own boundary. The dead appeared occasionally, half submerged near the bank, caught in eddies or snagged on debris. They did not move. Water had reduced them to obstacles, not threats. After an hour I noticed markers, not stacked stones like I'd seen in other places. Driftwood pushed upright into the mud at regular intervals, each piece angled slightly downstream. Flood markers. Not for warning, but for memory, to show where the river had been allowed to go. I stepped between them without touching. Nothing happened. The sense of being measured was gone. No internal pressure. No urge to correct my pace or spacing. My stride lengthened naturally, shortened when terrain demanded it. I drank when thirsty. I stopped when heat required it. Late afternoon brought the first real fatigue. Not the sharp edge of panic exhaustion, but the slow depletion that comes from sustained effort without adrenaline. I rested beneath a leaning cottonwood and let the river sound fill my head until thought loosened. I slept there briefly. When I woke, the light had shifted and the river had risen a fraction, wetting the toes of my boots. It hadn't surged. It had simply advanced, reclaiming a little space. I moved upslope without resentment. Out here, adjustment didn't feel like negotiation. It felt like fact. As dusk approached, I saw smoke. Thin, blue, controlled. Someone ahead had a fire. I did not approach immediately. Fires draw people for reasons that rarely align. I waited until full dark and watched the glow reflect off the water in broken lines. The fire stayed small. No shouting, no engines. No perimeter lights. Maintenance, not settlement. I circled wide and passed downstream instead, keeping the river between us where possible. As I moved away, the glow dimmed but did not vanish. Whoever was there wasn't watching the river the way I had. They were using it. That distinction mattered. By night I found a shallow cut in the bank where water had undercut clay and left a dry shelf above current level. I settled there without improving it. Drank sparingly. Listened. The river's rhythm here was clean. No artificial modulation. No delayed echoes. Just flow responding to grade and obstruction. I slept deeply. No dreams of gates or readbacks. No voices. No hum. In the morning, the river had shifted again, slightly lower now, exposing a line of wet stone that marked where it had paused overnight. Someone upstream had made a choice. Or the system had. I realized then that I no longer cared which. The dam would continue. The river would adjust. Downstream, people, human or otherwise, would build their lives around the new stability and call it natural in time. And I would move on, carrying nothing with me that needed to be calibrated to remain true. For the first time since the gallery sealed behind me, survival felt less like maintenance. It felt like participation. I stayed with the river for 3 more days. Not because I needed its guidance, but because it provided constraint without instruction. Banks limit direction. Current sets pace. It was enough structure to keep me moving without becoming another system to negotiate with. On the second day, rain came upriver. I didn't see it, but I felt it in the water first. The temperature dropped subtly. The surface texture roughened, micro ripples propagating against the main flow. An hour later, the level rose by a handspan, carrying fresh debris leaves, branches, a plastic crate fractured by impact. The increase was clean. No surge front, no panic in the channel. The dam had anticipated it, not predicted. Anticipated. The difference mattered. Prediction requires control. Anticipation allows response. I watched the water climb and fall again by evening, leaving a new wet line higher than yesterday's markers. The driftwood posts still stood, now partially submerged, still angled downstream. Whoever had placed them understood that permanence wasn't the goal. Memory was. That night, I heard engines far off. Not generators, not boats. Vehicles moving slowly, stopping and starting. Somewhere downstream, people were doing work that required coordination but not speed. I stayed out of sight and let the sound pass. On the 3rd morning, I left the river. Not sharply. Just let it curve away while I continued straight across higher ground, through scrub and broken stone where tracks don't hold. The land here showed signs of use. Old fence lines collapsed inward, a rusted culvert half buried but no recent passage. By midday, I found a structure. Not intact, not ruined. A pump station that had been shut down before the outbreak, its concrete shell cracked but standing, intake pipes choked with silt. Someone had cleared a path to it recently. Not repaired, just opened. The doors hung ajar. Inside I smelled smoke and oil. I did not enter. I circled once, wide enough to read without intruding. Footprints were present, but few. Heavy boots. Deliberate spacing. The kind of movement that comes from people who know where they're going and don't expect to be challenged. On the far side of the station, I found a chalk mark on the wall. Just one. A vertical line, not a measurement. A tally. I laughed out loud before I could stop myself. The sound startled me with its volume. I hadn't made noise like that in months. I moved on. That evening, I camped in a dry arroyo and watched the sky redden without thinking about flow rates or head pressure. The stars came out clean. No hum, no pressure, no sense of being observed. In the morning, I woke to something unexpected. Indecision. Not fear, not urgency. The absence of a defined next task. The dam had given me problems to solve until it didn't. The river had given me direction until it curved away. Now there was only choice, unscaffolded. I sat with that for a long time. Eventually, I stood and walked east, away from water, away from structures that remembered what they were built for, toward land that had failed completely and stayed that way. As I crested a low-rise, I felt, not heard, a vibration in the ground. Distant. Regular. Like a machine idling far below threshold. I stopped. The vibration faded. I waited. Nothing replaced it. Whatever systems still existed were not reaching for me anymore. They had found their own balance, or something close enough to stop searching. I continued on, slower now, letting uncertainty stretch without correcting it. For the first time since the world broke, I wasn't maintaining anything. I was just moving through it. The land east of the river resisted memory. No channels to follow, no gradients that implied purpose. Just low hills, salt flats, and scrub that broke apart underfoot and reformed behind me without leaving much trace. I moved early and late, rested through the worst heat, and stopped thinking in terms of progress. Distance existed, but direction felt provisional. On the second day away from the river, I found my first dead zone, not the walking kind, not bodies. A silence pocket. Wind moved around it, but not through it. Insects avoided it. Even the sound of my steps changed when I crossed the boundary, muted, as if absorbed. The ground there was cracked clay, bleached white, with no tracks old or new. I stood at the edge for a long time, testing with thrown pebbles, with breath, with movement. Nothing reacted. I crossed anyway. Halfway through, the vibration returned. Not strong. Just enough to register in my calves. Regular. Distant. It felt like standing above a pump station running deep underground, isolated by layers of earth and concrete. I did not stop. The vibration faded as gradually as it had come, leaving no echo. When I reached the far edge of the dead zone, sound returned all at once. Wind, my breath, the faint rasp of grit against fabric. The contrast made me dizzy. I sat until it passed. That night, I dreamed of the dam again, not as structure, as process. I saw gates that were no longer attached to concrete, opening and closing in open air, regulating nothing but still maintaining balance. Water flowed without riverbanks. Levels changed without consequence. There was no operator, no observer, just adjustment continuing because it had learned how. I woke with my hands clenched and forced them open. On the third morning I found tracks. Human, recent, 2 people, maybe 3, moving together but not tightly grouped. The spacing suggested familiarity without hierarchy. They crossed my path at a shallow angle and continued west, toward the river I'd left. I did not follow. I altered course south instead, increasing distance between myself and anything that still resembled organized intent. The ground rose slowly, becoming rockier, less forgiving. Water would be scarcer here. I accepted that cost without negotiation. By late afternoon, fatigue caught up with me, the kind that doesn't announce itself until you misjudge a step and feel it in your knees. I stopped early and made camp in the lee of a broken outcrop. No fire, no light, just rest. As night settled, the vibration returned one last time. Stronger now. Longer. It carried a pattern I recognized too late. Not mechanical, not natural. Coordinated. I lay still and waited for it to resolve into something actionable. It didn't. It simply existed for a while, then stopped. When it was gone, I felt something detach inside me. A readiness. A reflex to listen harder, to interpret, to prepare to intervene. I let it go. Sleep came unevenly, but it came. In the morning, there were no tracks near my camp, no signs of approach, no markers. Just the slow, indifferent light of another day. I packed and moved on, less certain than before, but lighter for it. Whatever systems were still running in this world, dams, rivers, people, they no longer required my participation to justify themselves. And I was done offering it. I lost count of nights somewhere south of the salt flats, not because time stopped, but because nothing marked it anymore. No routines, no systems to check at dawn or dusk, just light changing angles and heat easing enough to move again. I slept when my body insisted. I walked until it didn't. That was harder than maintaining a dam. Without structure, my thoughts wandered back to it anyway, not to the gates or the gallery, but to the moment when the system stopped asking me to decide. I realized then that much of what I'd called responsibility had really been arbitration standing between forces that no longer needed a human buffer. On the fourth day, I found water again. A seep, barely visible, staining a limestone face dark. No infrastructure nearby, no pipes. Just groundwater asserting itself where pressure and fracture allowed. I collected it slowly, letting sediment settle, filtering it twice. The taste was mineral-heavy but clean. I stayed there longer than planned. Not because it was safe, but because it wasn't optimized. The seep changed hour-by-hour flow, increasing with cooler night air, receding in heat. No one was regulating it. No one was correcting for efficiency. It simply was. That night I heard voices. Real ones. Not close. Carried on wind from somewhere upslope. Laughter mixed with argument, indistinct words, human cadence. A group, not large. They weren't hiding. They weren't broadcasting either, just existing in proximity. I did not approach. In the morning I found their traces instead. Footprints around a cooking fire, scraps of packaging, a hand-drawn map on cardboard weighted with stones, showing routes that avoided major structures. No dam, no pump stations, no grids. Someone had learned the same lesson I had, independently. I took nothing and left nothing. By afternoon, the land shifted again, becoming uneven and broken by old excavation pits, failed mining attempts abandoned decades before the outbreak. Rusted equipment lay half-buried, useless without fuel or coordination. I passed through without stopping. Near sunset, the vibration returned. Very faint now. Barely perceptible. It didn't feel directed, more like background radiation from a distant process continuing without urgency. I listened, acknowledged it, and kept walking. For the first time, it didn't feel like something reaching for me. It felt like something letting go. I camped on a ridge that night, and watched a storm build far to the west, lightning flickering inside clouds without thunder reaching me. Somewhere in that direction, the dam was adjusting gates I would never see again. Somewhere downstream, people were aligning their lives to the new, quieter flow. The world was still full of systems. I was just no longer inside one. As I lay back against the rock, I realized something else had changed. The fear that had kept me precise, useful, necessary. Not replaced by confidence or hope, just absence. And absence, I was learning, could be stable too. I slept under open sky and did not dream of concrete. Morning came thin and cool on the ridge. The storm to the west never crossed the divide. Its lightning stayed contained. Silent flashes inside cloud, a system discharging without needing to announce itself. I watched until the light washed it out, and then stood, joints stiff, pack lighter than it should have felt. I did not know where I was going. That used to matter. I walked south until the ridge broke into smaller spurs, and the land opened into a basin scattered with low brush and pale stone. No water visible. No structures. No tracks recent enough to read. The kind of place that does not reward optimization because there is nothing to optimize against. By midday, heat pressed down hard enough to slow me. I rested in the shadow of a boulder and let thirst dictate my next move instead of schedule. That was still a discipline, just not one I'd been trained into. When I stood again, the vibration returned. Barely there. A low, distant presence felt through bone more than ground. It lasted a long time this time, steady and unhurried. I could almost place it now, not a single source but many, synchronized loosely. Gates opening and closing, pumps cycling, people moving equipment, coordinating without centralized command. A distributed system. I realized then that what had frightened me at the dam was not being replaced. It was being generalized. The intelligence wasn't in one structure or one group. It was in the practice learning where intervention mattered and where it didn't, allowing correction to emerge instead of forcing it. I had mistaken that for erasure because it no longer needed my arbitration. The vibration faded. I waited, out of habit. Nothing followed. In the afternoon, I found an old service road reduced to 2 parallel depressions filled with grass. I followed it for a while, then left it when it began to curve toward higher ground in memory. The act of leaving paths had become easier. Near sunset, I reached a shallow valley where wind pooled and cooled the air. I made camp without improving it, without claiming it. Ate the last of my stored food and drank carefully. When it was gone, it was gone. No inventory math followed. As darkness fell, I listened. The world made noise when it needed to. Insects, wind, far-off thunder that never arrived, no hum, no pulse, no voice-marking variance. I lay on my back and looked at the stars until they blurred. For a long time, I thought about returning, about whether I could walk back to the dam, present myself as optional, and be allowed to remain as witness instead of operator. The thought felt neutral, not tempting, like considering a tool I no longer needed but respected for its design. I let the thought pass. Before sleep, one last realization settled in, quiet and complete. The dam had not learned how to exclude me. I had learned how to stop insisting on being included. That was the difference between maintenance and survival. Morning would come, I would move or I wouldn't. Either way, the river would keep finding its level, and the structures built around it would adjust or fail as they were meant to. I would not be there to smooth the curve or log the deviation. And for the first time since I sealed myself into concrete and control, that felt like an ending I did not need to manage. This is the final part of the record. Whatever continues from here does not require calibration.